Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi came from the east, arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and we have come to worship him." And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. He gathered together all of the chief priests and scribes, the people. He was inquiring of them where the Christ was to be born. And they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judea, are by no means least among the leaders of Judea, for out of you shall come forth a leader who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called the Magi and carefully determined from them the time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me, so that I may come and worship him too." Now after hearing the king, they went their way, and behold, the star, which they had seen in the east, was going on before them, until it came and stood over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi departed for their own country by another way. Thank you.
All right, good morning, folks. Good to be back with you today, and I'm going to talk about the star, the Christmas star, right? Because that's a fun topic, especially this time of year. And it's also fun for me to get to do a little bit more of a traditional sermon. I do a lot of topical stuff, but we're really going to just take a look at Matthew chapter 2 today and exposit that. So the question I want to answer is, what was the star that guided the wise men to Christ? I feel like as an astrophysicist, I can at least weigh in on this a little bit. There's sort of several levels of information that I'm going to give to you. Obviously, the text of Scripture is the one that's infallible. And so we need to remember that. There are other things that we can sort of logically infer from Scriptures. And then there are things that are really just conjectures that make sense of the Scriptures. They have to be consistent with the Scriptures, but they're not infallible. And so I hope that you'll keep those levels straight. We are going to take a look at Matthew chapter 2, and I'm going to actually just read through it. Eric did already, but I'm going to read a few more verses, and then we'll go back and exposit these. I think that'll be very helpful for you. So Matthew chapter 2, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him.' And when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he began to inquire of them where the Christ was to be born. And they said to him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod secretly called the Magi and ascertained from them the time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and make careful search for the child, and when you have found him, report to me that I too may come and worship him.' And having heard the king, they went their way, and lo, the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And they came into the house and saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And they, opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their own country by another way. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, 'Arise and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him.' And he arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, 'Out of Egypt did I call my son.' Then when Herod saw he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its environs from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had ascertained from the Magi. So I'm going to go back through and just kind of give you some of the background information that will hopefully help us to understand these verses a little better, and maybe fill in some of the details that the Bible doesn't explicitly state but would be reasonable to infer. And by the way, I'm going to spend the most time on the first 2 or 3 verses. So if you're like, well, he's only on verse 3, and that's okay. The rest of the verses will go very quickly. But we need some background information, I think, that would be very helpful to you. So Bethlehem means house of bread. And it's very fitting that the bread of life from heaven, Jesus, would be born in that particular town. Not a very big town. This was, of course, prophesied in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. I don't want to steal too much thunder from your next speaker who's going to speak on that, but that is where we find that information, that the Messiah would come forth from this little town of Bethlehem. We read about the days of Herod the king. This would be Herod the Great. There's more than one Herod in history. This is Herod the Great. And the thing you need to know about him is he was very wicked. He's a very wicked man, in case you didn't get that from the fact that he slaughtered 2-year-olds and under, so that he wouldn't have competition from a toddler. That gives you an idea for how wicked the man was. He executed his own wife and 2 of his sons, so not really a good father, all things being equal. Well, one of his own sons tried to poison him, so that gives you a little feel for it. He had bribed his way into power. He was not the rightful king of Israel or Judah at this time. He's not a descendant of David. As far as I can tell, he might not even be Jewish. He had apparently bribed his way into power. And so that gives you an idea of how wicked this man was. And this is the situation where God sends his son, this innocent baby, into this wicked environment. I mean, it's really, the suspense is just amazing. This would make a great movie, wouldn't it? God knows how to tell a good story, and it's not just a story, it's real history, of course. So now at this time in history, Rome had conquered the world. All of the subservient nations were under Rome's authority. They had to answer to Caesar. And Rome a lot of times would allow the nations that it had conquered to keep their own king and their own religious system as long as they paid tribute to Caesar. And so that's the case with Israel. Now, centuries earlier, Israel, of course, was divided at the time of Solomon into the northern 10 tribes, which retained the name Israel, and then Judah. And Benjamin really came along with Judah, but it was a very small tribe. And so the northern 10 tribes, they were disobedient. They never had a good king, right? The kings were wicked, and God eventually allowed those northern 10 tribes to be scattered among the nations. And so they're not in existence at this time as separate tribes. Judah remained. God punished them too from their disobedience. He allowed them to be captured by Babylon. And this had taken place about 500 and some years before the events that we're reading about in this section of Matthew. And so they were captive for 70 years, and then they were released. And so that gives us kind of a picture of the situation here. The Magi, those were scholars of the ancient world. It's where we get the word magic. It's related. These were priests and scholars of the ancient world, and probably from the Persia area. In fact, Magi is the Persian word meaning priest. So we have good indication that's where they're from. And the interesting thing about that is Persia would have included the area of Babylon. So there is a connection there. The Jews once lived in the area where the Magi are coming from, and that gives us a little bit of a hint as to how the Magi knew to expect the Messiah. They were part of the nation that had captured Judea, and so they were familiar, apparently, with some aspects of what the Bible says. So just to give you a feel for it, there is a map. So you have Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Bethlehem and Jerusalem are only about 6 miles apart. They're very close. There's actually 2 thumbtacks there, but they overlap because at that scale, you can't hardly tell the difference. And then you have Persia way over to the right, and so that's where the Magi are coming from. Babylon would have been kind of on the west side of the Persian area. So Persia is about 1,000 miles from Jerusalem. So that just gives you a feel for it. So now I'm going to travel 1,000 miles tomorrow, but I got a plane, so that makes it a lot easier. The Magi, they might have had it a little bit harder. It takes a little more time to travel that distance. The Greek historian Philo described the Magi as, quote, men who gave themselves to the study of nature and contemplation of the divine perfections, worthy of being the counselors of kings. And indeed, the Magi would often consult with kings. The kings would if they wanted information on something, why not consult the scholars of the time? And the Magi were well paid for advising kings. And so they were wealthy. They were wealthy scholars of the ancient world. It's good to be a Magi. They had their own personal army. They had their own library. They had a lot. And being scholars of the ancient world, they had time to sit around and think about things and study things. And they were knowledgeable of sciences, astronomy, chemistry, not by modern standards, right? Because they didn't know about atoms and molecules, but they knew that if you mix this substance with that substance, here's the result. They would have known as much astronomy as could have been known in the ancient world without telescopes. In the ancient times, astronomy was all concerned with how things move in the night sky and being able to predict where things will be. Being able to predict things like eclipses. That's kind of hit and miss with the ancient understanding of things, because they didn't really know how the solar system worked. But nonetheless, if you wanted to know when the next eclipse was, you'd consult a Magi, and they would have the best ability to at least make an educated guess about that. The Magi had the power and authority to depose kings. If there was a dispute about who was the rightful king, the Magi could be called in to settle that matter. So that gives you a little bit of feel for why Herod might have been troubled that these Magi were coming. So how many Magi? Well, we just sang 3, right? And that's what the Christmas cards show. But actually, the Bible doesn't say how many Magi there were. I suppose it could have been 3. It has to be at least 2 because it's plural. Magi, magus would be singular. So, but we think there were probably very many. And so that's one of those things that the Christmas cards really don't get right, is the number of Magi. There were certainly more than 3 Magi. Now, we don't know that all of them made the trip, though. But in any case, the Magi, most scholars believe that there were many Magi that made the journey. Some people think there were 3 because they brought 3 gifts, but you can have many people bring 3 gifts. That works as well. And they would have been accompanied by their own personal army. Okay, so this is not just 3 guys on camels riding through the desert. This is a caravan, a lot of people traveling. And that explains, again, why Herod was so concerned, because he finds that these Magi, these priests of the ancient world who have the power to depose kings and are traveling with their own personal army so they can enforce that, they're looking for the king of the Jews, which Herod thinks he is, and they're not looking for Herod. You can see how he would be distressed at that. Just imagine what he was thinking. It's very significant that Matthew records men from the east following the star and not Jews. The Magi, these were Gentiles from a pagan nation, and they see this star, they recognize it somehow as his star, as the Messiah's star, and they follow it, seeking the King of the Jews. And yet the Jews were not seeking the King of the Jews. That's really an indictment on how unbelieving Israel was as a nation at this time. And in fact, each of the Gospels focuses on an aspect of Christ's ministry. Matthew focuses on Christ's kingly office as the son of David, and therefore the rightful heir to the throne. And Matthew also is quick to point out how the majority of the people in Israel, Judea, were unbelievers. They did not receive their own Messiah. Even the religious leaders who would have been most familiar with the Bible and most familiar with the signs that the Messiah had come, what did most of the religious leaders do with Jesus? They wanted to kill him. I mean, it's the exact opposite of the response they should have had, which is to fall down and worship him. And so you can see Matthew is pointing out the great irony that it was pagans, Gentiles from a pagan nation, that were seeking the Messiah, and yet the Jews who were right there were not seeking the Messiah. Very interesting. And there's a lot of other indications in Matthew where Matthew points out the irony that the Jews were not looking for their own Messiah and were not doing what God called them to do, and so God took the message to the Gentiles, for which I'm very grateful. But in any case, Matthew 21, the parable of the landowner, remember that? Jesus tells this parable of a landowner who went away on a long journey, and his workers were working the fields, and he sent back a slave to collect the proceeds, to collect the fruit. And what did they do? They beat up one, they killed another, and he said, I'll send my son, they'll respect my son. And what do? They say, this is the heir, let's kill him too. And then Jesus asks the telling question, what do you think the master of the landowner will do when he comes? And they rightly answer, he'll put those wretches to a wretched end. And then Jesus explains, he's very clear, this is about you, this is about the nation of Israel, this is you guys. You haven't been producing the fruit, you've killed the prophets that I've sent, and you're going to kill the son. And that's not going to work out well for you. So this gospel of the kingdom will be taken from you and given to a nation producing the fruit thereof. Israel represented God's people in the Old Testament. And God's saying, no, I'm going to take that gospel from you because the people I send, you kill them. You kill my son, I'll give it to a nation producing fruit, and that would be the church. God's not using political nations anymore. In the New Testament, he's using the church, which is people from all nations. And of course, Jews can be saved today through the church by having faith in Christ, right? So it's interesting that in Matthew 23, there's a scathing indictment of the religious leaders. Woe to you, Pharisees, scribes, hypocrites. Matthew 24, that God the Son there is promising to destroy the temple. The temple represented Israel's special status as God's chosen people. And so God himself says, I'm going to destroy it. That ought to tell you something, right? And so in summary, what an indictment against the unbelievers in Israel. Now, there were a few that were believers, obviously. The disciples were Jews, and they followed Christ. So there were a few. But Israel as a nation largely rejected the Messiah, to the point that some people have said, yeah, Matthew, he's just anti-Semitic. He hates Jews. Well, he is a Jew. so he's not anti-Semitic. He's just pointing out that Israel was unbelieving at that time, and that's a fact. The majority were that way. So these Magi that are coming from this pagan nation, they apparently had some knowledge of the Bible because they're looking for the Messiah. So how does that work? Well, Judah had been captured by Babylon many centuries earlier, and they were there for 70 years. And so, of course, there's going to be some influence there. And Daniel was, of course, he lived during the time where Judah was captive in Babylon, and Daniel was a godly man. He's really the only major character in the Bible other than Christ who the Bible doesn't say anything negative about. Daniel was a very, very godly man. And he gained favor with the king. You survive the lion's den, that impresses people, right? He had favor with the king. And in Daniel chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, we read that Daniel was appointed to be chief of the magicians or chief of the Magi. Daniel was a Magi. And not just a Magi, he was the leader of them at one point. And so you can imagine he would have shared his knowledge of the living God. He wrote a book of the Bible that certainly would have been in the Magi library, right? Because they're his spiritual successors, as it were. So, of course, they would have known at least about Daniel. And Daniel, as far as I know, is the only book of the Bible that gives the timing of the coming of the Messiah. Do you remember the prophecy of the 70 weeks? Those would be weeks of years, so 490 years. And from the issuing of a certain decree to the Messiah, there's some debate about which decree exactly that's referring to, because there were several. But the timing's right. And the Magi would have known that. They would have known that this is the time that the Messiah is supposed to come. And then they arrive in Jerusalem. And I think it's interesting that they arrived in Jerusalem because Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So why did they go to Jerusalem? Keep in mind that the distance between the two, let's suppose that the star, we know the star eventually stood over where Christ was because the text says that, we read it. So let's suppose that there's a star hovering over Bethlehem, and the Magi see it from Persia. They would not be able to distinguish whether it was Bethlehem or Jerusalem from 1,000 miles away, right? There's only 6 miles difference, and they couldn't tell the difference. But they arrive in Jerusalem, and I'm going to suggest possibly the star was not guiding them at that time. They'd seen the star earlier, And then they get closer and closer to Israel, and then they don't see the star for a while, for whatever reason. Apparently the star wasn't guiding them at that time, because they come to Jerusalem and they have to ask where Jesus is, right? So for whatever reason, the star had vanished, or maybe it was just cloudy. Maybe they couldn't see it because they had a string of bad weather, or they arrived during the day. Can't see the star during the day. That's not going to work. So they arrive in Jerusalem. It would make sense if they didn't know the exact location, if they knew that the star was somewhere over Israel, but they didn't know the exact location, it would make sense to search for the King of the Jews in the capital city, right? That would make sense. So they arrive in Jerusalem and they say, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw a star in the east and come to worship him." It's interesting they ask, where is he who has been born King of the Jews, not if the king has been born. Apparently they knew the Messiah had been born. And how did they know that? Well, partly the timing. Again, they would have known about Daniel. He was one of them. And so they would have known about his book, and which predicted the timing of the Messiah. But apparently the star, they knew somehow that the star was associated with the Messiah. And that gives us a clue as to what this thing may have been. So we'll come back to that. So they knew he was there. They knew he was there somewhere, but they didn't know where. And so they're asking, where is he who's been born King of the Jews? That phrase, born King of the Jews, we take that for granted because we hear that around Christmas time. But you realize how unusual that is. Most people are not born king. You can be born heir to the throne. You can be born a prince. But you don't come to power until you're able to, competently give decisions. But Jesus is born king. He's already king at his birth. That's awesome. That's really interesting. For we saw his star in the east. His star. That's interesting. Now, rightly, all stars belong to the Lord, right? He created all of them. He's the Father of lights. He owns all of them. But it seems that there's something significant about this star. This is the star that's particularly associated with the Messiah. It's his star, Christ's star. And how did they know that? Well, I'll give you a hint here in just a moment. We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. We saw his star in the east. This is something that really bothered me when I was younger, because they're from the east, right? They're Magi that came from the east, from the Persia area. And they saw his star in the east, and then they head west to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, right? Isn't that weird? We saw a star in the east, and we decided to go that way. Weird. Or maybe some people have said, well, maybe it means they were in the east when they saw the star. Okay. So we being in the east saw his star, and then we headed west. We followed the star. But that's a little less natural. When you look at it in the Greek, it does seem to indicate that the star is in the east. But the thing is, when you actually look at the Greek wording, it doesn't say in the east. The literal Greek translation would be, we saw his star at its rising. Oh, okay. And some translations translate it that way. The ESV translates it that way. The New Living Version translates it that way. And that's a very literal word for word from the Greek. We saw his star at its rising. So why did the King James and other translations, the New American Standard, why do they translate it in the east? And the answer is because that's the way that you would say the east in Greek at that time. If you wanted to point to the east, you'd say at the rising, because the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And not only does the sun do that, but the moon does that, and all stars do that. Stars rise in the east and set in the west because the earth's rotating the other way. And so in the ancient world, if you wanted to say go east, you'd say go toward the rising. If you wanted to say go west, go toward the setting of the sun. If you've seen an old Western movie and the cowboys are riding off into the sunset, they're riding west. Right? So those terms are synonymous. In the east and at its rising, they mean the same thing. And so normally it wouldn't matter whether they mean in the east or at its rising, because everything rises in the east. But I'm going to suggest to you that this is how they recognized the Christmas star was unique, because it didn't rise in the east, it rose in the west. If it came and stood over where the child was, which we know eventually it did, then that would be hovering over Bethlehem. If it rose at the time that Christ was born, then from Persia, that would be in the western sky. They would see all the natural stars setting in the west, and they would see one star rising in the west. And the Magi, being knowledgeable of astronomy, would know natural stars don't do that. Natural stars do not rise in the west. Today, you can occasionally see a star rise in the west because we have satellites. But before 1957, no one had seen a star rise in the west, except perhaps the Magi, if I'm right about that. But how did they know it was his star? I'm going to suggest that they had read Numbers 24:17, Balaam's prophecy. And let's take a look at that. Numbers 24:17 says, I see him, but not now. I see him, but not near. This is referring to the Messiah. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. And isn't that interesting? So in Balaam's prophecy, the Messiah is indicated by a star or a scepter, both symbols of power. A scepter like a king's scepter, a star, indication of government, of power. And so this using poetic parallelism, which, it's written in a poetic way. Yeah, star and scepter go together. Jacob and Israel are the same person, right? And the same nation, two different names. And so you have that wonderful synonymous parallelism that characterizes Hebrew poetry, where you say something, you say the same thing in different words. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. And I would suspect that the Magi understood not only that this means the Messiah would come, but that there's a secondary literal meaning from this passage, that a star would literally rise out of Israel. And from their perspective in Persia, that would be west. They're looking west at Israel, and they see a star rising. And you could imagine somebody, one of the Magi think, there's a star rising in the west. That doesn't happen. What's going on there? And maybe another one, I remember reading something about that, a star rising over Israel, Numbers 24:17. So I'm going to speculate, and this goes beyond the text. I could be wrong, but I'm going to speculate that that's how the Magi knew that this was his star, is because it actually rose over Israel. And they recognized that as the fulfillment of Numbers 24:17, the star that's associated with the Messiah, the one that rises in the west rather than in the east. So that may explain how they knew that. And why they went to Jerusalem, because you can't distinguish Bethlehem from Jerusalem from that distance. But as they got close, apparently the star was not guiding them, because they end up in the capital city. And when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with it. And we now understand why he was troubled. The Magi have the power to depose kings, and they have an army to enforce that. And they're coming, and they're looking for the king of the Jews, who they think is not Herod. And you can imagine he's upset about that. What's disappointing is that all Jerusalem is troubled with him. All Jerusalem is troubled with him. The Jews should have been ecstatic about the coming of the Messiah, because Israel had been looking forward to that for thousands of years, ever since Adam fell into sin, and God promised that a seed of the woman, one of her descendants, would crush the head of the serpent, dealing with the problem of sin. God's people have been looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. And he's finally there, and instead of being ecstatic, they're concerned. They're more worried about the political situation. They're more worried about these, the Magi coming in and upsetting things, because they know he's a wicked king. How like us, right? I mean, Jesus is on the throne, and we get all upset about the specific politics in our own nation. So we need to be ecstatic that Jesus is in control of everything today. He's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So, verse 4, and gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he, that is Herod, began to inquire of them where the Christ was to be born. So he wants to get some information on this. This indicates to me that he's oblivious to this. He's oblivious to the star. He's oblivious to the fact that the Messiah has been born. He doesn't know about it. So he figures, I'll find out where. They're asking where to find him. I'll find out where, and then I'll trade that information, get some information from them. And so, and of course, the scribe said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And then they quote Micah chapter 5, verse 2. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Israel, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. They are quoting from the Septuagint. The Septuagint's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And that's why if you look at Micah chapter 5, verse 2, there's some very slight differences in the wording. That's because Micah 5:2 is translated from the Hebrew, directly from the Hebrew, whereas Matthew 2:6 is translated from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of that. So there's some slight differences in wording. But most of the Jews at this time in history really could not read Hebrew. but they could read Greek. If they could read at all, they could read Greek because that was the international language of the day. Before Rome had conquered the world, Greece had. And so Greek became the international language at this time. And so people sometimes ask, why is it that the early church read from the Septuagint? Did they believe that it was better than the original Hebrew? No, it's just that's what they could read, and that's what they had access to. So they don't quote the entire verse here, but they do quote that Bethlehem would be the place where the Messiah would come forth. The last part of the verse, which says this, it says, his goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. That is a powerful verse. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. And that may have seemed perplexing to the Jews of the Old Testament. It seems like, I mean, they had some understanding of the gospel. They knew that the Messiah was going to come and somehow deal with the problem of sin, and they believed God, and God counted that as righteousness, right? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So Old Testament believers were saved by grace through faith, just like we are, but they were looking forward to the Messiah coming, and they didn't seem to understand exactly how he would deal with the problem of sin. All the information's there, but it seems like they couldn't quite put it together. But this is one of those verses that may have seemed perplexing to them, because this Messiah is going to come in the future. He's going to come from Bethlehem and Judah, okay? And yet, his goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. He's always existed. How can it be that he has yet to come and yet he's always existed? And we in the New Testament understand that Christ is the God-man. As God, he has always existed, but he took on human nature at the time of the incarnation. He became one of us so that he could pay for our sins. He retained his godhood, of course. He's still God, but he's man now as well. So Herod secretly called the Magi and ascertained from them the time the star appeared. This indicates to me Herod was unfamiliar with the star. He didn't know about it. That also suggests to me, and the fact that the Jews apparently didn't see it, and by the way, as far as I can tell, there are no records outside the Bible of the star. This suggests to me that the star was not really bright, like you see it on the Christmas cards. If it was really bright, everybody would have seen it. This apparently was rather faint. It was obviously visible to the naked eye, because telescopes hadn't been invented yet, but it was not something that was tremendously bright. Otherwise, Herod would have already known about it, and everybody would have known about it. The Magi, being knowledgeable of sciences, astronomy in particular, they would have recognized that if it's unusual in some fashion, such as if it rose in the west. So Herod had to ask them about the time they saw it. And so that indicates that apparently when the star first appears, that marks the birth of Christ. And they said to him, it doesn't say in the text, but they must have answered about a year and a half ago, something like that. They probably gave him the exact time. But because we read later on that when Herod had all the boys killed under the age of 2, it was according to the time that he had ascertained from the Magi. Okay, so that tells him how old the child is now. So the point is, the Magi did not arrive at the manger scene. You will see nativities, no doubt, this year with three kings, right? Well, they weren't kings. There probably weren't 3 of them, and they were not at the manger scene. They arrived much later, probably a year and a half later. I would imagine Herod's rounding up to get the 2 years, right? He wants to cover his bases. And so, it took them time to make that trip. They have to travel 1,000 miles. We don't know that they recognized the star's significance right away. They might have seen it rise, and it might have taken them months to figure out what it meant. Maybe one of them said, I remember reading somewhere about a star rising over Israel, but they couldn't do a Google search for it. Right? I mean, they had to go through in their manuscripts and see where that was at. It might have taken them time to figure that out. It might have taken them time to prepare for the journey, and then the journey itself, 1,000 miles, you can do it. But by horseback, by the way, probably not by camels, because the Magi were wealthy, and in Persia, if you were wealthy, you had horses rather than camels. But in any case, they did not arrive at the manger scene. They arrived much later, probably a year and a half later. There's another way you could know they weren't at the manger scene. Remember when Joseph and Mary came to the temple to do the purification rituals for their firstborn son? They presented 2 turtle doves. We hear that in some of the music around Christmas time. They presented 2 turtle doves. Why is that? You see, according to biblical law, in the Old Testament ceremonial laws, when a child is born, for a male, 40 days after that is the purification ritual, I think for a woman, I think for a girl it's 80 days. In any case, 40 days after the birth of that child, they're supposed to go to the temple and they're supposed to sacrifice a lamb and a pigeon or a turtle dove. And that represents that represents Christ in a sense, that he's paying for their sins. Why did they sacrifice 2 turtle doves? There is a provision in biblical law, according to, this is in Leviticus chapter 12, verses 6 and 8. Leviticus 12, 6 and 8 tells us about you're supposed to sacrifice a lamb and a turtle dove. But God is very gracious, and he knows that some people can't afford to do that. And so there was a provision that if you were too poor to be able to purchase a lamb to sacrifice, you could sacrifice 2 turtle doves. That's why they did it. Joseph, being a righteous man, but not having any money, is able to sacrifice 2 turtle doves rather than a lamb and a turtle dove. Now that's significant because when the wise men came, the Magi, they presented gifts of frankincense, myrrh, and gold, right? If Joseph had had gold, he'd had plenty of money to be able to afford a lamb. So obviously that happened after the temple purification, you see. But in any case, probably a year and a half later is when the Magi arrived. And so they're going to trade information here. Herod, he called him secretly because he obviously doesn't want, if it's in public, if they're going to depose him, he doesn't want it to be in public. He calls him secretly. Maybe we can just talk about this in a hushed way. And they exchange information. They give him the time that the star appeared because he was unfamiliar with it. He gave them the location, and he sent them to Bethlehem. And said, go and make careful search for the child, and when you have found him, report to me that I too may come and worship him. Of course, we know that's not his intention, but he needs the information on the exact location. He knows the town. He knows it's in Bethlehem, but he doesn't know the specific location of the Christ, so he wants them to bring back that information so he can assassinate the Christ. But God has other plans. And having heard the king, they went their way. And lo, the star which they had seen in the east, or at its rising, went on before them until it came and stood over where the child was. So they've seen the star at least twice. They saw it, in the past, apparently at the time the Christ was born, because that's the time that Herod uses to calculate, age 2 and under. So they'd seen it when they were apparently in Persia, and then they see it again now after meeting with Herod. That's significant when we try to figure out what this thing might have been, that they saw it on at least 2 occasions. And it went on before them, it seems like to indicate that it moved, either apparently or perhaps literally. It moved in the heavens until it came and stood over where the child was. So the star moved and then stopped over where Jesus is. That's significant because that is very unusual, okay? So they see the star again, and when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Why is that? The text doesn't tell us specifically, but if my supposition's right, that the star had stopped guiding them at about the time they were getting close to Israel. That's why they ended up in Jerusalem, right? If I'm right about that, then they might have been a little bit discouraged. They've been traveling for months at least, and it's been a year and a half in the making that they've wanted to see this Christ child, right? And they arrive in the capital city, and nobody seems to know where he is. And they go to Herod. He asks them when they saw the star. He doesn't know about it. They might have been discouraged. They might have been thinking, does God really want us to see this child? Did we read the scriptures right? Are we understanding this correctly? So when they see the star again, they rejoiced exceeding with great joy. We're on the right track. And in fact, they probably recognized that they were very close at this point. Because if that star is hovering over the location of Christ and you're getting very close to it, you can tell, we're almost there. That may have been why they rejoiced. We just know that they did from the scriptures. And they came into the house. Apparently the star guided them to the right house. That's the one thing the Christmas cards get right. The star was apparently over the exact. They already knew he was in Bethlehem. They didn't need the star to guide him to the city. Apparently, it guided him to the correct house. And they saw the child, not the baby, the child, different word in Greek, although child's kind of generic. It could include babies, but it could include older children as well. Jesus would have been a toddler at this point. And they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Worship in Scripture can mean just bowing, could be bowing in respect, or it can mean bowing your will to God. It's an act of religious worship. And we don't know exactly which of the two this is, but the fact that they fell down and worshiped him makes me suspect that they probably really did understand the significance of this, that they were meeting their Creator face to face. That would be awesome. That would be awesome. Fell down and worshiped him, and opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And it's interesting because a lot of times in the ancient world, if one nation would conquer another, if they allowed that nation to continue to have its own government, the conquered nation was expected to pay tributes to the superior nation, give them gifts and so on. You give gifts to the king. You can see this in Genesis 43:11, 1 Kings 10:2. It was prophesied in Isaiah 60, verse 6, that Gentiles would come and bring gifts of gold and frankincense to the Messiah when he's born. And so that's interesting. This is fulfilled prophecy. Now, it might be self-fulfilling prophecy because maybe the Magi had read Isaiah 60, verse 6 and knew that's what they were supposed to bring. But either way, I think it's interesting that the Old Testament prophesied that they would bring gold and frankincense. I don't think myrrh is mentioned, but gold is again mentioned in Psalm 72, verses 10 through 15, where again you bring gifts of gold to the King of Kings. So now that we have kind of a little more background information on this, we're in a position to ask what this star was. And I have to point out, first of all, that we can't assume that star, as it's used in Scripture, means exactly what it means to modern astronomers, right? Words can change their meaning a little bit over time. In fact, the Greek word aster, that would include a number of different things beyond what we astronomers would call stars. It could include planets, for example. Maybe you've been outside at night and you see, oh, wow, look at that really bright star over there. And then some smart aleck comes along and says, that's not a star, that's a planet. Well, according to the biblical term, planets are stars, you see. It's just in our modern system, we classify them differently. Planets are, the ancients knew that there were stars that maintained their orientation relative to each other. The constellations are fixed, but there were 5 stars that moved. And those are called planets. Planet means wanderer. A planet is a wandering star. It's mentioned in Jude, actually, those that go away from the faith. They're like wandering stars. They're planets. So the Greek term could include that. It could include comets. These little things that have a little bit of a tail on them sometimes. They look kind of fuzzy. It would include a supernova, which is where a star blows itself to bits. Usually with a supernova, the star is invisible before it explodes. And when it explodes, it becomes very bright. And so it looks like a new star. That's what nova means, new. It's actually a star that's dying. It's blowing itself to bits. A small moon would do it. A small moon that was orbiting the Earth. If God created a temporary moon, that would be classified as a star. Or a close conjunction. A conjunction is where one object passes another object, usually a planet passing a star, or sometimes a planet passing another planet. That can happen. If it was a real close conjunction where the two looked like they were one object, you might call that a star. And by the way, every one of these has been proposed as what the Christmas star was. But the problem with all of these is that none of these do what the Christmas star did. Because remember, the Christmas star went ahead of the Magi, it moved ahead of them, and then it stood over where the child was. So it remained stationary over Christ. And I have to tell you, none of these do that. The natural stars rise in the east and set in the west. Okay, they're not stationary. The only star that's roughly stationary is the North Star, Polaris, because it happens to be right over Earth's North Pole. And so as the Earth rotates, it looks like it stays right there. But the problem is Bethlehem is not on the North Pole, right? The only star that could be stationary would be directly over Earth's North Pole or directly below the South Pole. It's just there happens not to be a bright star below the South Pole. And frankly, even the North Star wasn't the North Star at the time of Christ's earthly ministry because Earth's rotation axis changes over time. And so there was no North Star. The star was there, but Earth's North Pole axis was in a different direction. So Polaris would seem to move like all the other stars. So a star's not going to do it, nor is a planet going to do it, because planets do move relative to stars, but they don't move fast enough to stay over one spot on the Earth as it rotates. Planets don't move that way, nor do comets. Comets have very interesting orbits. They can, the planets are all sort of in the same plane. Comets can go vertical or backwards or whatever, but they don't move fast enough to remain over one spot on the Earth. You see, in order to stay over Bethlehem as the earth rotates, it has to move. And none of these things move fast enough. Now, a small moon might do it. A small moon, and I kind of thought that's what the answer was when I was younger. I thought a small moon would do that. Because there are today, we put satellites up, and if you put them, the farther away a satellite is, the slower it revolves. There's a certain distance where it will revolve around the Earth in 24 hours. And so it keeps the same spot over the Earth, right? So that's kind of neat. If those of you that have satellite television, the dish is pointed at one spot in space where that satellite is, because as it orbits the Earth's rotating, and so it maintains its position. I've seen some of those in a telescope, by the way, the geostationary satellites. But that only works, geostationary satellites would only be directly over the equator. At any other latitude, they would appear to go up and down because the orbit has to go through Earth's center. The center of the orbit has to be Earth's center. So a small moon's not going to do it because Bethlehem is not on the equator. So that's not going to work either. One of the more popular ideas lately is a close conjunction. There's a video out there on the Bethlehem star that a lot of people have seen, done by a lawyer. He seems like a nice guy, but I think he's mistaken because there were some conjunctions that happened around the time of Christ's birth. There was a conjunction of Jupiter and Regulus. Regulus is a bright star in Leo. And that happened in the year 3 BC on September 13th. And it was actually a triple conjunction. Now, these are kind of neat because planets occasionally, as they're moving along, they seem to kind of stop and back up and then stop again and go forward. And that the ancients didn't know why that was. We now know it's because Earth is passing that planet in its orbit. And so the other planet seems to go backwards a little bit. Kind of like I used to be in track, and when the guy on the inside would pass me, because I wasn't very good, I would appear to be going backwards relative to him because he's moving faster. The Earth moves faster than the outer planets, and so they seem to back up sometimes. And that happened, again, 3 BC. So Jupiter passed Regulus, backed up, passed it again, and reversed and passed it a third time. Pretty neat, kind of made a little circle around Regulus. Beginning in 3 BC, and that lasted a few months. It lasted well into 2 BC. Well, that date's not quite right, though. Most scholars believe Jesus is born around 4 or 5 BC. And so the date's not quite right. And frankly, that doesn't do what the Christmas star did. Jupiter doesn't move and then stand over where the child was. It circles Regulus, and that's kind of neat, but that's not going to get you to the right house. That's not going to work. There was another conjunction, this time in 2 BC on June 17th, of Jupiter and Venus. And Jupiter and Venus conjunct, that means one passes the other. That happens every 13 months, so that's not uncommon. What's uncommon about this one is that the passing was really close. Venus and Jupiter would have been so close, they probably would have appeared as one object briefly, for a few hours perhaps. And that's pretty neat. That's pretty neat. But remember, the Magi saw the star twice, right? Once when at the birth of the Messiah, presumably, and perhaps throughout their journey, and then again after meeting with Herod. But this conjunction of Venus and Jupiter, the real close one, only happened once on June 17th, 2 BC. And again, the date's not quite right. That's a little bit too late. We think Jesus was, again, around 4 BC. That would have been a better. And frankly, the conjunctions, they can't lead you to the right house. No natural object can. And so, since no natural object can remain suspended over Bethlehem for 2 years, I'm going to suggest to you that it was a supernatural light from God. And God normally uses natural means to accomplish his will, but he's not limited in that way. God can create a supernatural light that does something that no natural object can do. And apparently, that's what the Christmas star was, a supernatural manifestation of God's power that he created that rose over Bethlehem, rose from Israel in confirmation of Numbers 24:17. The Magi apparently saw it rising in the west, which no natural star would do. I believe they recognized it as the fulfillment of Numbers 24:17, and they recognized it as his star, the star that's associated with the Messiah. They made their long journey. The star was temporarily obscured for whatever reason when they arrive in Israel, and so they go to Jerusalem, the capital city. Nobody knows about the king, this king born of the Jews. And then after they meet with Herod, they see it again. They rejoice exceedingly with great joy and follow it to the location because it went ahead of them and stood over where the child was. No natural object will do that. And now once we recognize what's apparently a supernatural manifestation of God's power, then people like to speculate on that. And you can do that, but the scriptures don't give us any more details. Could it have been an angel? Sure. Angels are normally invisible, but God could give one a temporary luminous body to be able to do that. That's fine. Could it have been the very angels the shepherds saw? Sure, that's a possibility. From that distance, it might appear as a star. That's fine. Doesn't have to be that. Could it be the Shekinah glory of God? Could be that. Could it be an inanimate object that's luminous that God created for that temporary purpose? Could be that. But we know what it's not. We know it's not a natural object, because no natural object will do what it did. But this explanation that there's somehow a supernatural manifestation of God's power that rose over Israel, it answers the 5 questions that people ask about this whole account. It answers the question, why did the Magi go west? We have seen a star in the east, so we went in an exact opposite direction? No, we saw a star that's rising. And I'm going to suggest that it, unlike any other star, rose in the west. It explains what made that star unique, why it's his star, because only the Messiah star rises in the west. All natural stars rise in the east. It explains why the Magi recognized it. They were experts on the night sky. They were scholars of the ancient world. They would have recognized that no natural star rises in the west. How do they recognize it as his star? Possibly as the fulfillment of Numbers 24:17, which says a star will rise over Israel. All the natural stars were setting over Israel because it's in the west, and they see one star rising out of Israel. They would have recognized that if they were familiar with Numbers 24:17. And so I'm supposing that they recognized a star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. And then 5th, how did they arrive at the right house? The star didn't just lead them to Bethlehem. They knew he was in Bethlehem. Herod had told them that. It led them apparently to the right house. And a natural star won't do that, right? You can't say, okay, you go, okay, I'm under Vega right now, but now I'm not. No, you can't. It's too far away. This would have to be relatively close to the surface of the earth in order to mark out the right house. So I believe it's a supernatural manifestation of God's power. Supernatural is when God does something in an unusual and extraordinary way. And some people have a misconception about that. They think supernatural is when God intervenes or breaks into a world that sort of runs on its own. That's not biblical. Because some people think, well, supernatural is when God did it, and naturals means that God didn't have anything to do with it. Not at all. Natural is the normal, consistent, and predictable way God upholds his creation. Right? The reason the sun will rise tomorrow is because God is causing the earth to turn as it does. He's the one that causes that. He's the reason that there are laws of physics that we can study, because his mind upholds creation. I guess what I want to say to you is that supernatural and natural are equally manifestations of God's power. They're both manifestations of God's power. The atheist who says, oh, if I saw a miracle, if the sun didn't rise tomorrow, then I'd believe. I'd say, actually, it's because the sun will rise tomorrow that you should believe. Because in a chance universe, you'd have no guarantee of that. You'd have no reason to believe that. But God has promised me the sun will rise tomorrow in Genesis 8:22. And he's in a position to do it because he controls this universe. So natural and supernatural are both manifestations of God's power, but I believe the Christmas star was a supernatural manifestation because it's unusual. It's unusual to have an object that would rise over Israel and remain stationary there and be capable of guiding people to the right house. So I think it was a unique supernatural manifestation of God's power. That's my best guess. Anyway, it's the text that I want to make sure that we understand is infallible, and hopefully the conclusions that I've drawn, or inferred at least, are sensible. So we do have this presentation on DVD, His Star, and if you want some other resources too that I'd recommend. The Ultimate Proof of Creation. This is a very powerful resource that gives you a bulletproof argument for biblical creation that no one can refute. I have yet to have anybody be able to come against what this teaches. And it's not just the proof of creation, it's a proof of the Christian worldview in general. We have that on DVD as well. Understanding Genesis, how to defend the literal history of Genesis and why it matters. Christian doctrines depend on the historical understanding of Genesis, and we have a book on that as well. Taking Back Astronomy refutes the Big Bang in the billions of years. And we have a DVD on that same topic. Stargazer's Guide to the Night Sky, how to better enjoy the night sky from a Christian perspective. That's a fun resource. That's fun to write. And it's, if you want to get a telescope, what kind you might want to get and how to use it. But there's a lot of stuff you can see even with binoculars. There's certain star clusters you can see with binoculars are beautiful. You just got to know where to look, and that's where the book will help you. Keeping Faith in an Age of Reason answers over 400 alleged Bible contradictions. The secularists say, you can't, this verse contradicts that. Well, it doesn't, I checked, and that book's going to show you how to go through all those. Introduction to Logic, it's so important that we learn how to use our mind properly. And everybody thinks they know how to reason properly, but most people don't. Most people have never had a class on logic because they don't teach it in government schools anymore, and I think there's a reason for that. But in any case, there's a teacher's guide too if you want to use that with your students. One of the new ones we have is, it's called Get Logical. It's a Sunday school class that I taught that goes through the book, Introduction to Logic. If you want to get the best of our books together for a 20% discount, there's our book pack. If you want to get the best of our videos together for a 20% discount, our DVD pack, check out our children's resources as well. And please don't forget to sign up for our free monthly newsletter. So we just want to bless you with that. Make sure you put your email. It's an electronic newsletter. And check us out on the web as well at biblicalscienceinstitute.com. And I want to thank you very much for having me out to speak. God bless.